Hello, everybody, and welcome to the next ACFID DFAT webinar. Today, we're going to be talking about Australian NGO Cooperation Program and the accreditation for the ANCP. And I'd just like to introduce Rebecca Lysart, Manager of the accreditation, and Joe Thompson, who's an independent consultant and accreditation reviewer. So we've got about an hour scheduled, and I'll just hand over to Rebecca and Joe, and enjoy.
Great, thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. My name's Rebecca Lysart, so I'll be having a chat with you first of all, then we'll swap over to Joe for a while, and then back to me. So first of all, if I could get someone just to check whether they can hear me okay, so maybe write a message if the presentation's coming through and you can hear okay. I can see a few people typing. Yep. Excellent. Everyone can hear me. Also, it's hard to judge the speed of these things. So if I do suddenly start getting really excited about accreditation and talking too fast, just shoot through a message and I'll slow it down. In regards to questions, happy to take questions throughout if there's something burning that you want answered, but otherwise we do have time at the end. Okay, so this webinar is going to cover what the accreditation process is, suggestions for preparing for accreditation, and using the online system. All right, I've just got someone saying here that they can't hear me. Renee, I think, has just written in saying that he's having trouble. Can other people still hear me? Yes? Okay, so Renee, it might be an issue with the volume on your computer, so if I can just get you to try and have a play with that. Okay, but we'll just continue. And if anyone does cut out throughout this presentation, it is recorded and it will be put up on YouTube in the next few weeks. Okay, so I think everyone should be pretty familiar with the Australian NGO Cooperation Program, but for anyone who's new, this program's been running for over 40 years, which is pretty significant for an Australian government program. And the aim of it is to support the development activities of accredited Australian NGOs. So this year we have been allocated $128.8 million for the ANCP for the budget, which is an increase of $2.4 million this year, which is pretty significant. And I think, during this time where the aid program is heavily scrutinised, it reflects the high regard in which the government holds the ANCP and its effectiveness in delivering tangible results. So to be part of the ANCP, you need to be an accredited organisation, which is what we're going to be talking about. And to do that, you need to meet a set of established criteria. The purpose of accreditation is that it provides DFAT and the Australian public with confidence that the ANCP is funding well-managed and effective organisations that are accountable to their stakeholders. The accreditation process, which we'll get stuck into in a minute, requires NGOs to undergo a thorough and independent assessment of their identity and structure, development philosophies and management practices, approaches to partnership and development collaboration, linkages with the Australian community, and financial systems and risk management. The first part of applying for accreditation is to make sure that you meet the eligibility requirements. So The eligibility requirements include having a 2-year track record of managing development activities, being a signatory to the ACFID Code of Conduct and Annual Compliance, being an Australian organisation with an ABN, not be included on any of the international sanctions list, so their lists like the Asian Development Bank sanctions list, Attorney General's Department list of terrorist organisations, or any of the DFAT terrorist lists as well. Then we have another requirement, which is around having a minimum recognised development expenditure averaged over 3 years. So the levels for that are 50,000 for an organisation applying for base accreditation and 100,000 for an organisation applying for full. Now, RDE is an interesting thing, and we do have a separate webinar on recognised development expenditure. So if you're looking at how to calculate recognised development expenditure, I'd suggest you have a look at that webinar or go to DFAT website. We've got information about that, but it's far too important for me to cover quickly here. Okay, so for new organisations applying for accreditation, we have a 3-month window at the moment where we will accept new or applications from existing NGOs, accredited NGOs who want to upgrade from base to full. The application process opened today, so we're open from the 1st of August to the 31st of October. And we'll go through later in the presentation about how to log in to submit an application. Next year, those dates, that 3-month window will shift, and we'll be looking at an application date of starting around the 1st of July through till the end of September, and those dates will be published on our website. The reason we're shifting the dates is to allow enough time for DFAT to review applications for accreditation in time for the following financial year, so that everyone who passes can receive their funding. So in terms of when new applications are submitted, the NGOs will be assessed in the order that we receive them. So if you decide to submit an application on the 2nd of August, that organisation will be the first one we'll look at in terms of the new organisations going forward. With the change in dates, we should be able to get everyone through this financial year. For NGOs that are undergoing reaccreditation, and I notice there are some people registered here who are existing accredited organisations going through reaccreditation, those organisations can submit at any time according to the pre-agreed deadlines. So DFAT will generally write to accredited NGOs around 12 months out from their accreditation date, just to remind them of when we're looking at receiving applications. Okay, so the next slide that I've popped up here is a little bit about the timeframes, because accreditation is a long and complex process, both for the NGOs and also for DFAT. And there are a number of steps that we need to go through as part of the accreditation process. So first of all, as I was talking about before, it's submitting that application, or what's also referred to as the agency profile. But I guess I really should have added in another step before that, and that's looking at the Accreditation Manual and getting an understanding of what accreditation's about, and doing a bit of a self-assessment to make sure that as an organisation you're ready to apply for accreditation. So once you've made that decision, then you submit your agency profile. Once it's submitted, DFAT will do a eligibility check, so making sure that the agency meets the criteria that I spoke about before, and then we'll pass it on to our review team. So DFAT contracts independent review teams to undertake the accreditation reviews initially. So those teams consist of a team leader who's a development specialist, another development specialist, and then also a financial assessor as well. So DFAT, once we've done that eligibility check, we'll send the profile through our IT system to the review team to conduct a desk assessment. This is where the team will look at everything that's been submitted as part of that agency profile and do an initial check against the criteria. It's normally around 4 weeks that a desk assessment takes, and after it's been drafted, DFAT will review it and then send it on to the NGO. Simultaneously at this time, the review team is often in contact with the NGO to sort out a date for the organisational review. So the organisation review is a 2 to 3 day site visit to the organisation. So in the desk assessment, there will be recommendations about what to prepare for the organisational review. And then once the organisational review date has been set, the review team, along often with a DFAT observer, will come for a visit for 2 to 3 days where they'll go through in further detail some of the documentation that's been submitted, and also have important conversations with key people about processes and procedures. So after this, the review team will make a recommendation to DFAT about whether the organisation should be accredited or not, and that comes in the form of an organisational review report, which DFAT will review and provide back to the NGO for comment. So there is a chance to fix any factual errors and also to provide a response to that report. Once that report's been accepted, it goes to the Committee for Development Cooperation. Now, the CDC, or the Committee for Development Cooperation, is a joint DFAT NGO committee that one of its tasks is to review accreditation for DFAT. So at the moment we have 4 DFAT representatives on that committee and 4 NGO representatives as well. They'll make a decision, a recommendation, I should say, out of that committee, which will then be sent to the DFAT delegate for final approval. So the DFAT delegate at the moment is the First Assistant Secretary in the Humanitarian and Partnership Division. So those 5 steps generally take at least 6 months, if not longer, depending on when the Committee for Development Cooperation is sitting. So it is a long process. We do have a lot of reviews happening at the same time, so it's a busy time for everyone. But it is not a good process. So that sort of outlines the process and the flow of accreditation. What I'll do now is hand over to Jo Thompson, who is one of our long-standing independent assessors, who will be able to talk you through the accreditation process a little more.
Hi everyone. Just looking down the list of names, I think I've met quite a few of you before. Others, your names aren't familiar, so we probably haven't met. But as Beth said, I've been working as a reviewer doing accreditation reviews for many years for my sins. Accreditation's been around for years now. It was started in the late 90s, around 97, and it's gone through a whole bunch of reviews over the years where the criteria have largely stayed the same or similar, but just been adjusted in line with industry standards and accountability expectations and so on. So the bar has risen over the years, but just in line with good practice. And it's the accreditation criteria as they sit now are largely consistent with the ACFID Code of Conduct. So the sorts of practices that you're expected to have in place to be compliant with the ACFID Code are pretty consistent with the accreditation criteria, with a few extra little special gems in there from DFAT just around some safeguarding aspects, but really all of that's reflected in the code too. So most of this should be familiar with you as ACFID members. And there might be some new NGOs in the group listening today that haven't been through this process. Others, I think, have been through it and might be looking at an upgrade or just going for reaccreditation again. So I just thought I'd run through with you some of the key principles that underpin the accreditation process. And the fact that it's underpinned by principles in and of itself is actually really important. This is not an audit process that is absolutely prescriptive. It's based on a set of principles that the group of people that undertake the reviews, and DFAT and the CDC that Rebecca was just talking about, all of us hold these principles pretty dear actually, and fight for them. So I'll just go through some of these now so you're a bit more familiar with them. Oops, wrong button I've just pressed. Oh, there we go. Yeah. Accountability and transparency. This one's really important. As I mentioned before, and you probably all know, there's a set of criteria, and the fact that they're really well known in the sector. Whenever there's a change made to them, that's pretty widely consulted amongst the NGOs in the sector to get buy-in to those, so that everybody is fully aware of what's expected of them. Okay, that's fine. Essentially, accreditation is a front-end risk management process or part of risk management processes for DFAT. So DFAT do a really thorough and rigorous assessment of an NGO's capacity, institutional capacity, to implement development programs, and that then gives them the assurance that you can go forth, if you like, and implement ANCP funded programs. So the ANCP itself is a pretty unique program worldwide, where a donor is funding an NGO's own programs within pretty broad parameters, and accreditation enables NGOs to access that funding. There we are. It's a peer assessment process. So people like me, the other reviewers that may come to your agency to assess your organisation, are all experienced NGO and development professionals. So we've all, it's a fairly small group of people that undertake the reviews, but we've all been working in the Australian NGO sector for many, many years and have all held jobs with NGOs. So we've been inside NGOs being accredited as well as undertaking the reviews. So in that sense, it's being undertaken by your peers. The CDC that Rebecca referred to oversees the process, and they have elected NGO representatives on that committee and always have had, and they've got a pretty strong voice on that committee. And that's always been really important to ensure the quality of the review process and the consistency of it. So obviously it's humans involved in all these processes, so there's going to be some differences in approach, but having such a clear set of criteria and lots of checks and balances in place limits that differentiation between reviewers so that it's relatively consistent. The process is meant to be collaborative and participatory for the NGOs. So by the time we come as a team to your organisation's office to do the organisation review part of the process, we're aiming to establish a collegial and cooperative dynamic with you and your colleagues, working together to try and understand the approaches that you take. All NGOs approach their work slightly differently and have little unique aspects to them, and it's our job to try and understand that and work with you to understand how you satisfy the accreditation criteria. The assessment is evidence-based, Evidence, though, we take in its broadest meaning, so that could be documented evidence, but also the discussions we have with you when we visit your agency are equally important. But we certainly do need to see documented evidence of your practices, processes and practices and your claims, if you like. So as an organisation, you're assuring the review team that you undertake a particular practice in a certain way, then we need to see that borne out in documentation as well. But it's certainly the combination of both the discussions with you and project files, whether that's electronic or hard versions, it doesn't matter, but that sort of documented evidence. Our sector is very diverse, and while there is a set group of criteria, the way that each NGO applies those and puts them into practice will be slightly different. So we're keen to work with you at your agency to understand how your organisation does that in your particular or unique context and the way your organisation is set up. And I think by and large over time we've seen that the criteria and the indicators there can accommodate the diversity within the sector. The accreditation process is aimed at also fostering continuous learning and quality and capacity improvement in the sector. Having been involved with this for years, there is no doubt in my mind that accreditation has improved practice and standards in the sector. It's a two-way street, obviously, it's driven by the sector as well, but having something that NGOs have to aim for and be assessed against provides the discipline and rigour in the sector that has definitely had an impact. And we would really encourage you, and I'll go through some tips around preparing, but I think this notion of continual improvement is something that you all can use in your use accreditation for in your organisations as a discipline, sometimes as a stick for boards or whatever the case may be in your organisation if you're trying to improve practices in a certain area. But it's a great way of providing that framework and discipline in your organisation to continually improve. And accreditation is reflective of good practice. As I mentioned earlier, the accreditation criteria have been periodically reviewed and they reflect what we consider to be sector good practice. And as that changes over time, the accreditation criteria have changed with that or sometimes driven that. And it's, as I said before too, it's consistent with the ACFID Code of Conduct. So anything that you're being asked to do through the accreditation criteria in that process, you'll more than likely find in the Code of Conduct as well, and it will be reflective of good practice. So it's all stuff that your organisation should be doing regardless of the funding attached to it. I've put together just some suggestions that might help you to think through in terms of your preparation for accreditation. It's a time of fair amount of anxiety for most NGOs getting ready for accreditation. There's a lot hanging on it for most organisations in terms of the funding and credibility and so on. I think one of the most important points, I guess, is the one I was just talking to before, is to use this process as a way within your organisation to continually reflect on your practices and policies and so on, and use it to improve practice over time, rather than just hitting a sudden point a few months out from the 5-year cycle of accreditation and all panicking and trying to change things quickly. So allow plenty of lead time, and even more than that, I would suggest just integrate it with your normal quality improvement cycle in your organisation. Use it as the discipline in your organisation to systematically reflect on and improve your policies and procedures over time, and use the accreditation criteria as a framework to do that within. Most organisations spend at least a year, often longer, preparing for accreditation and reaccreditation. And this helps it become just a normal part of your quality cycle within your organisation. But as I said, better still if it just becomes a normal part of the process and it's not happening sort of even at the 12-month mark out. Engage the whole organisation in the process. This is not just something for the programs people, which is often where it lands in organisations. They tend to get lumped with all the preparation. Really important that you get buy-in from your board, from the CEO, and then all the way through the organisation. There's aspects of the criteria that are the domain of your finance people, of your fundraising and marketing people, your HR department, certainly your programs people. But it's a big downfall we've seen in many organisations is where the poor old programs team just gets lumped with all of it. That one. Having a track record of the use of your policies, guidelines, templates, and so on is really important. The accreditation criteria talk about a 2-year track record. This doesn't mean that you can't be continually improving. It doesn't mean that every policy and procedure that you've got must have been used for exactly 2 years. But this is really aimed, the 2-year track record issue is often aimed at new organisations trying to enter the accreditation process in the ANCP, or organisations that are very small perhaps and trying to move from base accreditation to full accreditation. So it's not that we need to see, as I said, a full 2-year track record of every policy and procedure, but we've got to be able to see really strong evidence of your policies and procedures being implemented. So if the ink is still wet from last week and we can't put together a strong picture that you've been implementing the practices for a reasonable amount of time, then that becomes a problem. So just bear that in mind in terms of the timing of when you apply. Sometimes we see organisations that really they would have been so much better off if they just sat on it for another 6 or 12 months to build up a better track record. Don't overstate your practices. This is another pitfall. There's great sharing amongst organisations, which we would really encourage, of policies and procedures. But big pitfall, I think, for smaller organisations particularly is adopting highly sophisticated policies and practices or procedures, written procedures of large, more complex organisations, and they're not fit for purpose. They're either too complex for the work you're doing, or they just don't actually reflect the reality of how you're working. So by all means, share amongst agencies. I think that's a great practice to learn from each other, but make sure what you're saying you do is borne out in practice and can be verified through evidence. By all means, reflect on your practice and lift it if you need to, and using the accreditation criteria is a great way of doing that, but don't overstate what you do. There is a focus on documented evidence, as I've mentioned before, but we certainly take that hand in hand with the discussions that we'll have with you. That's how we understand those policies and procedures and how you're implementing them. But you do need to show documented systems such as your policies and procedures and templates, and then work examples to demonstrate how you're implementing those and how they meet the accreditation criteria. So be prepared with that. Talk to your peers. It's really important that you meet together and talk with other accredited organisations. Most importantly, those that have been through the process recently, just so that if there are changes to the criteria and so on, that they're aware of it. So liaise with as many organisations as you can that have been through the process to get their insights into how they prepared, if they've got some resources where you're trying to improve some of your practices. Most organisations will be happy to share them. And just so that you know what to expect with the accreditation process and so on. It's really, really important. It's very evident when organisations sometimes because of geography, if they're in a state where there's not many other NGOs, or they don't have access to perhaps attend ACFID training courses and so on. It's pretty evident when they're not really abreast of the process and the principles that underlie it. Be really clear about how your agency addresses the criteria. Each agency has their own unique ways, and it's very important that as an organisation you think through your own narrative or story on this really carefully, and that your staff have a shared understanding of this. I mean, it's really good practice anyway, just in terms of socialising your approaches and philosophies and so on within your organisation. So use it as part of that process if you want to. But I think it's just so important for NGOs to be clear on how they feel they address the accreditation criteria, because it will be different for each agency. And it's up to you. If you have a unique way of doing that, that's fine, absolutely fine, but you need to be able to tell that story. Don't be afraid to use examples in projects or partnerships and so on where things have gone wrong. These can often illustrate really well what your management response has been and how your agency responds to risk. No one that would come to review your agency would expect that all your projects are nice and shiny and clean. And in fact, if that's what they were seeing, they'd probably start to get fairly suspicious. So don't be afraid to wheel out some of your less successful projects or mistakes, issues that have arisen through monitoring and so on, because what we're really interested in is how you've responded to that. Prepare for the organisation review visit. Rebecca mentioned before that there's a 2 or 3 day visit where the review team will come to your office and meet with all of your key staff and review documents. Getting the balance for this right is challenging. So many organisations will prepare responses to issues raised in the desk assessment report and prepare documentation of examples of practice that might support how you think you address the criteria or the issues that have been raised in the report. But bear in mind that the review the organisation review at your office only goes for 2 or 3 days, usually 3 days. But by the time you add in introductions and feedback sessions and so on, we've largely got about 2 days to talk with you and review documentation. So don't drown the reviewers in paperwork. Partly because as a reviewer, it's very difficult then to have time to discuss with staff members and really get a nuanced view of how the organisation works, because you feel somewhat obliged to look at all the documentation that you've so busily prepared. But certainly some preparation of documentation before the organisation review is a really good idea, so that you're not floundering around when the review team arrives trying to find examples on files and so on. And you may find things like, you haven't got the files or don't have access to the files in your head office, that they're held in country or something, and that's too hard to organise quickly. So get yourselves prepared. And on the preparation aspect, just that of documentation, that's a really good reason to talk to other agencies and see what they've done. Many organisations undertake a mock assessment internally beforehand, so perhaps after they've prepared the agency profile, even perhaps after they've received their desk assessment report, they might undertake a mock assessment where you run, particularly for some of your staff who might be feeling anxious about it, it's a good idea to run them through like possible questions or scenarios, get them to defend and talk through a narrative on how particular projects have worked and addressed the criteria, just so that people are a bit more comfortable with what might be coming. Really good idea, I think, to start looking at other organisations to help each other to do those sorts of assessments, so organisations that maybe have been through it recently. That's the end of my slide. Sorry, I thought there was another little thing coming there. So that's largely some tips there for your preparation. I'm really happy to answer any questions though as we go on, probably at the end now. There's no questions popping up right now, I don't think.
There was one, yeah, there was one before that I'll just go back and respond to. So, Catherine, and I'll just restate the question because this is being recorded for the future. So the question was, when DFAT writes to you for a reaccreditation, does that give you 12 months notice until the application is due, or 12 months until the existing accreditation expires? It's 12 months until the application is due, which is generally the time when the accreditation would expire. Saying that, though, we would not, for an accredited organisation, we wouldn't let an accreditation expire as such. So we'll try and fit the review in before that 5-year date, but if it doesn't quite fit in, you would remain accredited at the level until that accreditation review is finished. So I hope that answers the question. Okay. Okay, so there's another question around, is there any likelihood that the accreditation criteria will be revised in the next 12 months? There are, as Joe was saying before, and I was mentioning, we do look at the criteria from time to time, and it has been, there's a few years now since the last criteria.
2014.
Yeah,
I think,
yeah. So that's
review.
Where are we now? 2017. So 3 years. So it is getting to the time where we probably will start to think about having a look at the accreditation criteria and just making sure it's still current and it's still meeting the DFAT's requirements and the sector's needs as well. But if we were doing that, we would write out to everyone to let them know, because we would be consulting with the sector on that, and also the Committee for Development Cooperation would be consulted and acted, and other parts of the department and so on. So, yeah. Okay. So if anyone else has other questions, just feel free to write them in. I'll either answer them as we go or leave them until logical pause in the presentation. Okay, so we've spoken about the process, and Joe's done a great job of explaining what the reviewers do and providing some good tips. Now's the really exciting part of the presentation, which is using the accreditation online system. So I'll run through this pretty quickly because I'm sure everyone has logged into a webinar, so I'm assuming everyone here is pretty tech savvy. But to access either the reaccrediting or the new or upgrading NGO forms, you just go to the DFAT website, and the link's there on the page, and you click one of the application links. Now, they should have been updated to reflect that we're in a new year. So hopefully when you go there, that will be updated. And also in this presentation, you'll see that the dates are old in the presentation. Just ignore those. They're still all the same information there. So the link will take you to our system, which is Smarty Grant. So for those NGOs that are already funded through the ANCP, you'll be pretty familiar with that system. So you log in. It lets you know the opening dates, and this is more for the new applications. For reaccrediting applications, that will just have an open end date. You can preview the form by clicking preview the form. There's also a copy of the accreditation or agency profile form on the DFAT website as well that you can look at. All right, so you need to log in, so that's pretty standard for how you log in, and you hit fill out to fill out the form. Clicking through that. And when you log in, a couple of tips: make sure you save your application regularly, because Smarty Grants has a habit of kicking people out after about 30 minutes. So if you don't save your work as you go, you can lose your work. You can log back in at any time, so you can see on the slide at the moment, when you log out, it will just, when you log back in, there'll be it will show you the application that you'd started. Now, if you create duplicate applications, just get in contact with us and we'll be able to delete one. Moving on, to click through the form, it's all pretty standard. You can click by pressing next page or previous page, or clicking down the form navigation menu on the side, and it goes through all the criteria there. And as I said before, make sure you save your progress as you go, so you don't lose your work. I've had that happen to me before. Pretty frustrating. So yeah, Smarty Grants is pretty straightforward, but if you have any issues, make sure you email through any problems. So we've got a dedicated email address, which is just up on the screen, which is accreditation@dfat.gov.au, or you can always give me a call as well. And my name's Rebecca Lysart, so if you just go through the DFAT switch, they'll be able to pop you through to me, or you know, if you're listening to this way in the future, whoever's in the role at the time. Now, we've had a couple of questions pop up. I'll just bear with me while I scroll through them. Okay, so Jerry's asked, if I could just restate my role. So my name's Rebecca Lysart, and I'm Assistant Director in the ANCP section at the moment, and I'm the Manager of Accreditation. Hopefully, answer the question. Okay, so we've got another question around, or a continuation of the question about if there was a potential revision of accreditation criteria, and a follow-up to that is, if the criteria were to be updated, would there be, fully understand that there would be full and wide consultation on that, what would the time frame be? And that is being asked because the impact on agencies. If we were to do a review, this would be part of the consultation process with the sector and with the CDC to minimise the impact on agencies going through accreditation or new accreditation. I would also anticipate that I don't think we would see throwing out of the current accreditation criteria and having something completely different pop up in its place. It would be more of a refresh to make sure it's still current, but we would certainly make sure that it didn't impact negatively on people's accreditation. Okay, so next question. Okay, we've got a question. My organisation's last accreditation was a paper submission. We've been told that this means our prep time will be longer for a total of about 18 months. Is this correct? So accreditation used to be a paper-based application form, where I think it was before my time, but you used to be required to fill out the agency profile and send in, I think it was 2 to 3 copies of all your documentation to DFAT, which just meant folders and folders and of documents that we'd receive. The lead time for either an online application or a paper-based one would be the same, because as Joe was saying before, it's about making sure your organisation is prepared and you have your policies up to date and that sort of stuff. So I don't think the lead time would change at all. Joe, do you have anything to add on that one?
I can't see how it would change it, really. If anything, I think in terms of submitting your agency profile and evidence, so on, it's easier online, so that hopefully should save agencies some time. When the criteria were last reviewed in 2014, there was a pretty significant cutting back of questions required to be answered in the agency profile. So you might actually find that the volume of information required in the agency profile is less than when you last did it. Hopefully that will make that aspect of it a bit more streamlined. The preparation time, though, depends on whether you're talking about writing your agency profile responses or whether you're talking about just reviewing practices in your organisation and making sure everything's shipshape. I think 18 months, 12 to 18 months is a really great amount of time to sort of out from the process starting to have a reflection on your agency's processes and so on. So that shouldn't change whether it was a paper-based application or an electronic-based application.
Okay, so we've got a thanks, Joe. Another question: who are the NGO representatives on the CDC? Okay, so this is going to test my memory, but we have at the moment we've got Kayleen Caffarella from Red Cross, John Morley from Plan, Mark Webster from ADRA, and Anthea, someone who is just new and whose last name I can't remember, but I'll find out for you and respond in a few minutes. Okay, so the next question is a question about how are DFAT progressing their thinking around managing contractors with requesting accreditation type documents / checking for accredited Australian NGOs. So if you have a look at on the DFAT website, we have, which is available for everyone to see, so it's publicly available, is it's the, I'm trying to remember the name of it, the aid programming guide, which talks about accreditation being equivalent to a due diligence assessment for DFAT. So where this question I think is coming from is in situations where some of our programs and our overseas or have been contracted out to managing contractors, and those managing contractors then requesting certain due diligence checks on NGOs. So we have been working with a number of posts around this issue to talk through simple ways of sharing, not the information so much, but sharing the acknowledgement that these NGOs are accredited. So if there were situations where a managing contractor was requesting information from the accreditation area, so my section, we would be contacting the NGOs to let them know if we were looking at sharing any sort of information. But it is something that we're working with the CDC reps on at the moment as well. All right, so thanks to Renee, also, who has just popped up that it's Anthea Stinks at Oxfam, so apologies for forgetting her name. Okay, and there's a link to it's on the ACFID website as well. Okay. So I think we've responded to all the questions that have popped up. Are there any other questions that people have around accreditation? So I should point out too, I think I sort of skimmed over it, that the Accreditation Manual has a lot of information in it, including, most importantly, the criteria, and that's available on DFAT website, and there's a direct URL that I've popped up there. So by all means, have a look through that, and if you still have questions, you can always email them through to accreditation at dfat.gov.au as well. Okay, so we've got another question. The question is, when accreditation says you need to ensure that the partner has XXX, are you asking us to guarantee that their in-country processes that they tell us they use actually are used?
Yes, is the short answer to that. The review obviously these days doesn't go in-country to verify that. So the sorts of ways that we would look for evidence of that is how you are assessing your partners in the first place. You'd be expected to have some type of capacity assessment process in place for your partners so that you're assuring yourself that you know what their processes are. And they may or may not be the same as your own. Sometimes they are, because you might be working with a partner to establish or improve their processes, or sometimes you might be working with a partner who has their own processes. But we'd certainly be looking to see that you're assessing them so that you know what's going on with them. And then, yes, for evidence of that, we would look at, completed partner assessment, agreements that you have in place with partners that might point to very particular aspects of compliance or practice that's expected, monitoring reports where you've met with your partners and undertaken an ongoing assessment of how their practices are being implemented, email communications with partners that might be able to reflect on their practices, or discussion between yourselves and them. Certainly, if you've got on your own files copies of your partner's policies, or if they have procedures, manuals in relation to certain things, that's great to see. So they're the types of things we'd be looking for.
All right. Okay, next question is, if the submission date is early November, what is the likelihood that the review will be before Christmas? It's probably very unlikely because of the time frame that we have around sending the agency profile to the assessors to write a desk assessment, and then allowing the NGO sufficient time to respond to that. So in some cases, if it was late October, early November, maybe we could possibly squeeze it in, but I would say it will probably be after Christmas. But that question's from Marianne, but Marianne will be in contact with you as soon as your profile's submitted about that as well. Okay, another question. Is the assessment solely against the criteria, or is there a minimum size and scale of the organisation other than the RDE requirement? Apart from the RDE requirements, the assessment is solely against the criteria in terms of size and scale. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to add to that, there is no limitation on the size. So you could be a very small organisation, but you've just got to have some track record of working formal documented partnership with in-country partners and implementing some work together.
Next question is about global programming. So I'll just read this one out. So this is about global programming and the definition of global programming. Could you please give us your understanding of global programming? Is this primarily for emergency relief operations, or would this also be covering all development activities for a development agency? We are trying to decide how to address this criteria.
There's a bit of a history to this criteria, or this aspect of the criteria. It came in a number of years ago when there was a shift taking place, which is much more established and dominant now. But there was a shift taking place for Australian NGOs that were implementing their own programs through partners, and the funding was going from the Australian NGO to in-country partners, towards a model where Australian NGOs were sending funds to a larger parent organisation that could be based in anywhere really, London, US, Europe. Sometimes the Australian NGO is that mothership, and then funds were pooled there and then sent out sort of according to a much bigger global strategy, say, they were sent out to in-country partners. It applies the notion of global programming and assessing the role of the Australian organisation applies to both humanitarian and development programs, so it is across your whole portfolio. And basically what the review team is looking for is an assurance that as the Australian NGO who holds the contract with DFAT, that you know what's going on and that you're able to intervene if you need to. So that you've got some sort of input into global strategies, if that's how the funding is being distributed globally through a larger organisation, that you have systems or some sort of documentation in place with in-country partners bilaterally, so that you have got a relationship and you've got influence, and that you can intervene if necessary, and you've got the contractual, the contract in place to sort of underpin that. That you're receiving reports of some sort from your partners or from, I suppose, the global organisation, but just so that you're in an informed position to know what's going on, if things are progressing, if things aren't progressing, and that you're in a position to intervene if you need to. Okay. So I think Kate's typing again. We'll just see if that clarified it or not. To clarify, there's a question here saying, to clarify, this means an INGO? Yes, it does. It really relates to Australian NGOs that are part of a larger global organisation generally, and usually the sort of global head office that may determine how funds are distributed globally is elsewhere. It might be in the US, or how funds are distributed globally is elsewhere. It might be in the US or Europe or the UK or somewhere. Sometimes that's the case that the Australian organisation is the main parent body, if you like, but more often than not, that's not the case. So it's becoming a much more common model, and it's not. There's nothing negative about that model. It's a model that is pretty firmly entrenched now in our sector, and there's a lot of benefits to it. So you're not going to be penalised because that's your model at all. In fact, it's becoming more and more dominant, and there's a lot of really good reasons to work that way. But we need to know that as the Australian NGO holding the contract with DFAT, that you know what's going on and can intervene if needed. Okay. I think. Yeah, I think unless Kate has. Oh, here we go. We've got another question. So the follow-on is, if an Australian NGO is directly funding a partner NGO in a particular country, and the funding goes directly to the program and not through a head office, but both NGOs are part of a global NGO, would that be counted as global programming? No, it wouldn't. It wouldn't. So that's a bilateral relationship that your NGO, the Australian NGO, has directly with an in-country partner. The fact that you're part of a much, a larger global network of organisations makes no difference. Global programming is where the Australian NGO is sending the funding to another organisation within an INGO alliance or federation, and then that organisation is deciding at a sort of global level where and how to distribute the funding. So if you're working directly in a bilateral relationship, that's fine. The other is fine also. Don't think that there's anything wrong with global programming. It's just that we need to know that the Australian NGO still has a role.
All right.
Okay. Well, thanks. I think that's all the questions that we have time for this afternoon. But thank you all for participating in the webinar. It's really great to see so many people logged in for this one. If you have any further questions, as I've said before, just email them through and we'll try and get to them as soon as possible. Just appreciating that we've just gotten through the annual development plan period with the ANCP, so we've been a little busy, but we will get back to you as soon as we can.
All right. Hey, thank you, Rebecca and Joe. If you can please show your virtual thanks in the comment section, that would be great. Really appreciate you guys coming along. Just to note that the next DFAT webinar is on ANCP annual reporting on the 22nd of August. So please register for that if you're interested. And also don't forget, I think when you get out of the webinar today, there'll be a link to the SurveyMonkey. And if you could just please provide some feedback, that would be great, so we can help keep improving these services for you. Thanks a lot again, Rebecca and Joe.
Bye.